All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Phil Woolery, Purdue Extension here. We're at our last session of our in-season crop updates. And we have Shaun Casteel, our soybean specialist, going to talk about some early season soybean issues. So we'll get started. And I think I'll look at, you can do questions. Shaun, how do you want to handle questions? We can do them as you go.
That's fine, yeah. So I'll just go ahead and give the talk, and then if there's questions, I'll just count on you to kind of interject. It'll be hard for me to look at the chat box and slides, but if you see something, yeah, just interrupt me just like normal.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Well, Phil, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and get the screen share, and hopefully you can see it, as well as no. Phil, you need to unshare your screen, I think, for me to get to mine. Well, try it this way.
Okay.
All right, Phil, are you got my screen now?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, excellent. Let me get laser if I want it. All right, well, appreciate the chance to talk with you guys, whether you're watching live or going to watch it later. Appreciate the opportunity to just kind of share what's going on. This is going to go through some of the standard things that we see early season, as well as what we have seen already. So a little recap, maybe a little forecasting. Don't know if I can have a crystal ball to hit all of that, but we'll get into some of these early stresses and early development and decisions that we have made or we will make, and what we can anticipate. So I think the best thing just to get in with this is to, we had some of the early season opportunities to get plantings in, and then temperatures certainly come into play. And so we've got our typical 50-degree mark is what we kind of shoot for, but we did have some fields, depending on where you were, that were able to push plantings as early as April, and even a few early April. That's not every field by all means. I mean, I've got some of my research plots there at the Penny Purdue farm that didn't get planted until the first week of June, just because the ranges kept hitting left and right. But as we think about soil temperatures on the early side, and then with some of the cold snaps that we had, 50 degrees is one that we've traditionally thought of. We do have some soybeans that can handle lower temperatures, and a lot of this is dealing with the water temperature initially, and then following that up. So the soil water temperature, and then following up with just overall soil temperature and growth and development. There can be a loose association, so I've got a couple slides here on loose associations with the number of heat units as we progress from planting into emergence. So let me escape that one. There we go. So here's a case in point. So we did a number of pretty intensive emergence studies over the years, and taking one from when we were looking at the exact emerge planner, and pretty intense on that, and using that as a nice data set to look at how many heat units, and we're just the modified heat units that we typically use in corn is what I'm talking about. And so air temperatures, how many heat units, GDDs, until emergence. So over a couple of years of that intense study in various populations, you can kind of walk through the, let me get the laser back. There we go. Kind of walk through how many heat units does it take to reach approximately, let's say, 50% emergence over a couple of those years. And, one was no-till, another was conventional till. So right around that 140 heat unit mark. So 50 to 75%, we're on the order of 140 to 160 heat units. So if you had just planted last week, obviously they're probably already cracking it up if you had adequate soil moisture. Clearly, soil moisture has to come into this play. But if we're having this discussion, let's go a month or two ago, this is always on people's minds of, okay, how long are those soybeans going to sit? how long can they withstand the colder temperatures, and seed treatment's coming into play with that. But instead of a 7-day or even 5-day plant to emergence, we're looking at 25 days in a lot of these cases, that it's 3-4 weeks. And usually you can have a pretty good association with the air temperatures, assuming you've got adequate soil moisture. So 140, 160 is a good ballpark. And again, with what was just planted and assuming we have adequate soil moisture, those should be already up and growing pretty fast. Growth stage wise, I think this is always good to kind of go back so we're talking the same language. So at this point, we're talking vegetative emergence. We have the cotyledons and the growing points are above the soil surface. So as we look through the hypocotyl, that is the first. I don't have it in this picture series, but that is the first one to emerge. So it has a neck kind of bent, and that's right what's cracking. And then you start to have the sun that causes the feedback for the plant to bring the cotyledons up and foliates. This is important when we think back about if you had fields that were planted in April and early May, and they were close to emerging and they caught that freeze. Where were they at? Because if the hypocotyl was exposed, that's an issue of damage and then breaking off as they continue to try to grow, versus now the growing point is above the soil surface. So cotyledons, unifoliates, and then trapped within those unifoliates is the growing point. So the first trifoliate and the ones to follow. And so those are prone to have issues, whether it's freeze damage, if it's deer or chickens for that matter. With a planting date type talk or soil temperatures, there's a concern about potential inhibitional chilling. And so I saw a number of fields, and I'm going to kind of go back on that May 8th, 9th freeze. The days prior to that, we had a lot of fields that were getting planted. And so if there was ever a time to have this, I guess, challenge of a inhibitional chilling of soybeans, that was probably going to be it. I've yet to really see it play out in the field, but it's just good information to still have in your back pocket. In this series of pictures, we're looking at a very controlled environment to look at the temperatures. These are flats of soil, so the change in soil temperature can happen very rapidly and very thoroughly within that flat of soil instead of a field. A field has a lot more buffering capacity, and it's more than temperature. And so here's a case in point that Thursday, Friday, so would that have been May 7th, May 8th, leading into the forecast for a hard freeze the night of the 8th and the 9th. I was getting a number of phone calls about whether to keep on planting or not. Field conditions were fit. And not knowing what that Friday was going to be like in terms of the day and then the night, I told most people to cut off, not be planting within 24, 36 hours of that Friday night, because it's that same 24 to 36 hours right after planting the cold, wet soil. So it's the cool, cold soil water that is the biggest. And so that's the biggest concern. And so here's what that plays out like in a very controlled environment. Picture on the left is one seedling that was planted in a moisture regime, temperature regime, adequate moisture, basically 60 Fahrenheit soil temperature for 4 days, normal growth and development with the radical emerging, and then the one planted on the right on the first 24 hours is just below 50 degrees, so 48-degree temperatures. Again, soil water is right there, and then switch very rapidly, because you can in this situation, to that same 59, 60 degrees for 3 days. It gives a nice visual of what's going on. It's really that first 12, 24 hours of water uptake, that inhibition of water, and then if it's cold water, that causes issues with development. And so issues include the processes, enzymes, some membrane leakage, so some of the physiological effects of that colder soil that's being imbibed. Now, if we had seeds that were planted in dry ground and it's cold, that's really not as much of a concern, because it is a matter of the cold water being taken up by the plant. And then if you want to continue on that same series, go out to the 10-day mark after seeding it, you have the continued development with hypocotyl pulling the plant up above that flat. again, they've taken it out of the soil, but it has that same 59 degrees for 10 days versus the one on the right had that inhibitional chilling. So that first 24 hours at 48 degrees, so it doesn't seem like much, but it is pretty devastating what it can do, even though the following 9 days were adequate 59, 60 degree type soil temperature. So that beginning 12, 24 hours is really critical on soil water uptake by the seed. And then here's just a couple of visuals of a similar thing. So much warmer soil, but the concept is still the same. Having them in these flats, 17 days, warm soil, very warm soil, 77 degrees, and adequate development coming into V1 in these flats. So first trifoliate showing expanded. And then another scenario similar to what we saw earlier, that the soil was cold. They went down 45 degrees for just the first 20 hours. And then just, a snap, turn of a switch, literally warming it back up to 77 degrees. And you can see what the stand looks like in that scenario. So this is the worst case scenario in a very controlled environment. So if we were to have any of these issues let's go back to our May 7th, 8th time frame, it was these kind of conditions that we're potentially worried about. I will say how that Friday went, at least here locally. I think it was decently across the state. If you were just planting, the day before, the days before, that Friday, it was a cooler temperatures, but we had hardly any clouds, and so we had very good radiant heating. So the sunlight was there, and so the soil temperatures themselves were probably much warmer than they would have anticipated being if it was a cloudy day at that same, let's say, 55, 60 degree air temperature. And then now you've got that radiant heating in the soil that provides a more buffering capacity as our temperatures were dropping drastically that night of the 8th and the 9th. To buffer those air temperatures. Another thing that comes into play with planting under these conditions and forecasted conditions is the depth of where the seed was placed. So those that are probably looking to go 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches even soil depth have more soil. Doesn't sound like much, 1/4 to 1/2 inch, but then those that are just dusting them in are 1 inch. And so that buffering capacity of soil really comes into play. And then here's a fun one, right? This isn't real world example, but it gets back to the physiological effects. Here's just the first 8 hours, very warm soil, water conditions, 77 degrees, and then they turned it cold, 45 degrees, soil temperatures, water's right there too, I'm sure, for 4 days, and then back to warm. So overall, germination emergence looks pretty solid, probably similar complete percentage as what you saw in the first picture of 10 days at 77 degrees. Now you would notice that these are a little delayed in development, which that's fine. You've got 45 degrees for 4 days, so you do have heat units in the way the plant grows and develops. So, but the overall inhibitional chilling, the emergence, germination emergence itself wasn't hampered by that cold snap within the 4 days after the initial uptake of warmer water in this case. And then here's just some series of pictures of a field I followed here locally prior to that freeze coming in. So these beans, as I found out as I visited the field a number of times, were planted, I believe, about April 4th, 5th here, Tippecanoe County area. And so not looking too bad that night right before the freeze was coming. So coming into VC, so I have the cotyledons and unifoliates fully expanded, no issues there. And then go back about 16 hours after the freeze. So visited it that Friday night, came back that following Saturday night, and already seeing some of this pretty significant damage from heavy freeze, right? We're probably down to 28 degrees, 27 degrees. Upwards of maybe 6 to 8 hours, depending on where you're at across the state, and certainly as we're talking more northwest, more hours of these colder temperatures if you had beans up. So we've already hit the ones that were just planted, and would they have a potential for inhibitional chilling? Now, I'm talking about those that are already emerged. In this case, they already had the hypocotyls already cracked and then brought up the cotyledons and unifoliates. And so in this case, we have the full plant above ground and the growing point exposed. So in this picture, that Saturday night, already saw significant damage on several plants. And what's crazy about this is how there seems to be no set pattern. A lot of times you can have it's a residue issue, it's a soil moisture around that residue or the microenvironment. In some cases, it have exact same, no residue, and have some plants look great and others don't. So just the way that's kind of soil settles in, or air moisture and temperature settles in. So plants on the left already, freeze damage and dying. You see the cotyledons and growing points already dying. The one on the right, that's one at that point is an iffy. You've got the growing points already been burned out. You've got the unifoliates. Cotyledons are pretty bad, but there's still enough green tissue. That's where when we're making these assessments, you can almost kill yourself to be out there the day of or the second day after a freeze. Really, on the order of 4 or 5 days is kind of the first point where you can really have an assessment of how bad this damage is and whether this guy is going to continue kind of to croak or he's going to be the iffy one that starts a split stem. But this is just 16 hours after that freeze event, and then same day, just different part of the field. So plant on the left, clearly dead, dying. It's not going to recover. Plant on the right, again, we're talking 2 inches away. We've got the growing point and unifoliates are burned out. But those cotyledons, these are in better shape than the previous slide. Green, you have a little tinge of the yellowing on the margin, and that could even be seed treatment with that particular field. And so that gives us hope on that one that, yeah, we're going to burn out the tops, but we've got auxiliary buds. So buds where the cotyledons attach, unifoliates attached, they're on opposite sides of the stem. And then if we're talking a plant that was a little bit more advanced, whether the trifoliate was burned out or not, and then taking out that apical dominance, so that top meristem, top growing point dominance taken out, but then a secondary one to take over. And I'll follow a couple more series of pictures on the same field and going now 2.5 days later after the freeze, or about 2 days later after I took those pictures Saturday night, just continue that overall death. We had overcast skies, if you recall, moderate temperature, so nothing very hot. And so you're kind of stalling out how much of a recovery you're going to see or how fast of a death. But looking at these two plants close up, again, these are dead. The one on the left, you see some green tissues, but it's on its way out the door. And then a similar light that you've got growing points burned out, unifoliates, but we do have these cotyledons on both these plants, green and then auxiliary. So we'll end up having a split stem where you have two main stems coming off, one each side of the cotyledons in that scenario. And as you're assessing or assess those kind of fields, it's about how many of the good, bad, and the uglies do you have to make that replant decision. Having a split stem, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, you've already got a plant that's advanced in development versus something that you're just about to seed, and so it's going to take time to get to that point. This is that internal debate of whether to replant or not based on a calendar, and then also about, okay, we've got soybeans that responded to photoperiod and heat units. We've already got the advantage of developing ahead of time before the photoperiod really starts to push us. And so I think there tends to be more of a yield advantage, even keeping that split stem, or if nothing else, they're at a moot point that there's not going to be yield difference itself. And then you've got spots, again, 2.5 days later that you have absolutely no damage on a few of the plants. Others are going to have that split stem. And I'm sure you guys have seen these in the past, but just kind of given the 2020 freeze and what kind of response we got. Then we're coming into 6 days later and looking at these plants. So the ones that are obviously the unifoliates are fully green. Those were not touched by the freeze, but in between, just 2 to 3 inches apart, we have those plants that have the growing points burned out, but the cotyledons, they're still greenish to yellow. I'd say every one of those in that picture. So 1, 2, 3. Those are going to split stem and survive, and then clearly the ones that are VC 1, 2, 3 going to keep on growing and developing like normal. Now, as you might anticipate, there'll probably be some differences if you're to look at these plants individually later in the season. The big brothers, I'll call them, that are VC, they are going to have more nodal development, whereas the ones that are will be delayed in development, like these that have been burned back by the freeze, they'll split stem, they'll have fewer nodes, and they'll kind of struggle a little bit, but they'll eventually come up to speed. They're not going to be the same yield level individually, but on an area basis, it won't matter. It's that beauty and frustration of soybeans. They'll compensate, and so they won't have as much of a yield provision to the field, but they're not going to be a yield detriment. In other words, they're not going to become weeds, if you might think of it in that way. And again, just 6 days later, what does it look like? So you had the initial water soaking, within the first 16 hours to 2.5 days, and now again burned crispy, sun shining now 6 days later, versus those that are going to continue to grow and develop like normal. And then here's just another series of deader and doornail. Growing points are gone, unifoliates are gone, but these two cotyledons only plants will split stem and be just fine. And so here's a close-up of the same thing. Even with this yellowing off to the left side, it'll stay, won't have any issues, and develop. And here's a picture of one that split stem. So again, you've got the growing point that's already been burned out. In this case, you've got the cotyledons, and then you have a split stem. So as you think about the way that's going to develop, it'll have the same nodal development. It'll have the branching on each one of the stems. One thing that may occur later, if they're loaded up really well, you might have a little proneness to some lodging if it's loaded up. But in most cases, the tissue callus up pretty well and can support that plant. So that's what we're under. A lot of people are trying to make that call whether replant or not. Put out an article and video on this, but it's the same whether it's a frost damage, if it's emergence issues, replant's still on that 70,000-ish plant number, whether to call the ball. Here's a couple slides. We'll switch gears a little bit because crusting is always something to consider, and certainly as we've gotten into a few areas of caught some pounding rains and then turned the 90-degree mark, those soils are having issues or drying out. But in the crusting scenario, same kind of thing that comes to mind in terms of where the growing point is, and is it going to be able to push through that soil or not, or snap its neck and not have any opportunity. So here's a case in point where the cotyledons on this plant were sheared off. Okay, so in this case, not the growing point, but the cotyledons. And so those are kind of like a starter fertilizer, if you will, for the plant to get up and growing. So they don't have the energy reserves from the cotyledons at this point. They do have the unifoliates, so they're being exposed to the sunlight. They'll start to develop, but it will take a little time for that to occur. In other words, they're not going to develop as fast because they don't have the cotyledons to provide the photosynthates as well as plant sugars and some of those nutrients that come out directly from that. If you're looking at an area basis that's lost, maybe a cotyledon on most of the field, you will probably rarely see a yield loss with those. It's those that have lost 2 or so that are going to be 2 to 7% yield loss with that. You can also see the swollen hypocotyl, giving an indication of how hard that soil was to push through. Rotary hose, seemed like we had a few of those running. I know up in the Northeast, we had some of those scenarios that were planted that first, second week of May, drier soils, they got the cold temperatures, then they got the pounding rain, even in no-till conditions. And so I knew of a number of guys running rotary hose and just trying to break up that crust. And so nothing new, but it's still one of those pieces of equipment and curiosity of how much do we gain or not. So a few years ago we had similar issue occur, and so let's just make some lemonade with lemons. And so we did a quick little comparison study, right, looking at rotary hoe versus crusted. And so with that rotary hoe, it's going to be bringing up some plants that are already emerged or emerging, so that's always an issue of potential loss. But then they're breaking up that soil, so then there's not as much physical restrictions to the plants that are emerging, and then allow those to break free. Clearly, a softening rain helps in that too. And then actions of those fingers cutting part of the cotyledons. So if you use the knowledge you just got on crusting, if we lose one cotyledon, we're probably really not losing out on yield, lose both. There's a potential. So that's that give and take on what you get with yield response, with the damage to the plants, and then ultimately the stand count itself. So here in this scenario back in 2017 when we did this, 7 days after doing the Rotary Hoe event, plants on the left, and stand counts, and you can see it in the picture as well as the numbers that we counted. We had about 11,000 more plants per acre on those that were Rotary Hoed versus those that were crusted still and didn't get a softening rain to allow the other plants to emerge. And so if you want to have some hardcore numbers with this particular example, really more of a demo, we did it as research and replication, but each field and soil condition will vary a little bit. But initially, what was the stands? Total alive at the day of Rotary Hoe, 64,000 and change, 70,000 on the two treatments. And then 7 days after actually hoeing the plot, we were on the order of 98,000 plants versus those that were maintained crusted and had about 87,000 plants. So that 11,000 plant increase was certainly evident. Was it enough to cause a yield change? No. Again, this goes back to that soybean and how much it can adapt. That early development VE to VC, the plants are already making the decision to branch and then to make up for that lost stand because it's not sensing its brothers and sisters in that community. So a stand of 87,000 is still not going to be anything that's going to cause us yield loss of any major level, if at all. And so our target normally is 120,000 plants, but then when we're switching our mind to whether to replant or not, it becomes 70,000 just because of how much you really have to drop down in yield potential before gaining anything with an overseeding, or worst case scenario, you even till up or burn out the whole thing. So at the end of the day, an 87 versus 98,000 plant stand on 15-inch rows did not have any yield difference, even though we had an improvement in overall plant stand. Moving on, so I mentioned this stage, and I think it's good to bring it back. So VC, vegetative cotyledons, and unifoliates. So we kind of put that subset, subscript U, VCU. That's when both cotyledons and unifoliates are fully expanded. That energy reserve we talked about from the cotyledons, and then that initial just growth and development from harvesting sunlight and what's going on. And then coming into V2. So I bring up VC to V2. A lot of this replant, those decisions should be made by VC. V1, V2, it starts to get into the point of, okay, what do we really gain? Because we have already had plants established that they're going to start branching because of a subpar plant stand. V2 is that stage where we've got a lot of the fields starting to go into V2, V3, again, depending on where you're at, maybe even further along, where we're starting to have that off-green color on the V2 plants because they're switching gears from just nitrogen supply from the soil as getting into fixation. So with this idea of replant and overseeding, we get past fixation. I think we're good enough on that. Had a study on this looking at the timing of delay, so whether that's delayed in development, like we're kind of already been talking about, whether there's a freeze damage, crusting, or straight overseeding because of a subpar stand. So we had the scenario where had no delay, so they were all planted at the same time versus at 15-inch rows and then interseeded at VC when the original stand was VC, and then 15-inch rows when they were interseeded when the original stand was V2, and then jumping off the cliff when the original stand was V4, interseeding, and then creating a delay in development. So what do those look like? And I think Phil and Bob and others are doing a similar demonstration there at Penny Farm, and so they might be doing some videos to kind of show you what it looks like in real time for this season. Here's some of the data that we collected a number of years ago, so to kind of follow that through. So at this scenario, we had an original stand of 50,000 plants plus another 50,000. So what I mean by that is the original stand on 15s were 50,000 plants per acre. We made sure we thinned it down to that. And then the inner row, so the one that's between the two 15-inch rows, was another 50,000. And so the top left of that same day of planting, no delay. So that overall plant stand is 100,000 with no delay in development. We go to the second treatment, or really the first delay that we've created, was when the original stand was VC. And so that 50,000, and then interseeded when it was VC. And then we had those developing down below that canopy, so kind of creating probably about a one-stage difference, give or take, and then going down to V2. In this case, you can really see the differences. So when it was originally V2, interseeded, and so the day of this picture, back when we did the study, original stand was V7 coming into R1 probably, and then you have those that have merged, they're foliating, they're really elongating, trying to get up because of that shading effect. And so the overall stand still 100,000, but the development is different in what proportion is going to come from those original stands versus those that were interseeded. So again, V2, I know a number of people that would even replant at that stage, but really if we're replanting or overseeding, it's this VC V1, which is always a tricky thing to say, are we done with the original development, or are we going to get a softening rain, or whatever it is to bring those plants to light. And what I mean by that is, let's go later in the season when you can look at the original stand, original plants, what they look like in terms of physiological development versus those that were interseeded or intentionally delayed. And the no delay, so 50,000 at planting, 50,000 between the two rows, so equal distribution in terms of pod development, no development between those two. So as you would anticipate, 100,000 plant stand, no issues, no weed control or weed suppression-like effects, or weed competition, I should say. Then when we go into VC, this is what I've alluded to, and here it comes out in practice. So the original stand, 50,000 plants, with no other competition from weeds or another 50,000 seeds until after this point, had already been sensing the light quality. So the branching occurs, so they're going to make up for having more abundant light, less shading, and so they have this far red light ratio, and they move through, versus those that were delayed in planting, i.e. delayed in development. And you'll see very straight stem, slender, no branching whatsoever, really just trying to stretch out and get up to the same level in terms of harvesting sunlight, and then to start to balance that, how much is coming into that plant versus the original. And then when you go into the V2, same, you already have the branching that's occurred. The delayed planting or delayed developer is developing, but in terms of branches, in terms of what we're really concerned about, pod load and seed load, next to nil. And so the contribution from that delayed development of V2, V3, next to nil, maybe 5-10% at this kind of populations. Whereas you go back to the VC, we're probably more like 80% is coming from that original, maybe another 20,000 coming from that delayed development. And this is, again, the beauty and that frustration of how they can balance between different growth stages and placement and populations. And then when you jump off the cliff, right, V4, original stand, you interseed, they just flat shade out that delayed development, and it's a twig and doesn't provide any contribution to the yield. But I'll be quick to say it did not suppress the yield either. So it wasn't a competition in such a way that yield was suppressed either. Okay. And then just to a little higher population, 100,000 plants in that same scenario. This one's just kind of, you go one step further just to see it. So 100,000 plants, we really shouldn't be doing anything anyway in terms of replant or overseeding, but you can catch the same trend in terms of no delay, VC, V2, V4, 100,000 original stand on 15 shading out pretty well. So you can kind of already guess what's going to happen later in the season, right? That you have not just a twig at V4, but you also have the twig at V2 because you have so much already shading out by the V2, V3 point. And so more of a shift in terms of what that delayed developer is going to provide to the overall yield of the area. The VC, much smaller plant, does provide some pods. That original stand does not have the branching to the same level you have twice as many plants. You have 100,000 on 15s versus the 50,000 of the previous treatment. And then go back to the beginning. 100,000, they're really not going to be branching that much because the overall stand is 200,000 plants. Okay. So moving forward a little bit, the supplemental planting, if we were to look at V2s, just to kind of put the nail in the coffin one more time on this idea that whether we're to go and replant a V2 on a stand that's 66,000 or so, let's just drill on this guy. Original stand, nothing done to it, 50, 51 bushel. Certainly not as high as the 55, 56, 58s, but are you going to gain anything beyond that? And so what I mean by that is if you go in and overseed at 130,000, you have the same overall yield level, still just a hair above 50 bushel. 10.5 bushel comes from that overseeded, 41 bushel comes from the original stand versus not doing anything and still getting the same yield level. So that's kind of where this information is coming from. Give you a little numbers behind the recommendations that we've had over the years. So I'm at 30, 40 minutes here. Let's move on a little bit about seed depth and how that has an effect on overall development, right? It's about access to moisture. And so that's all I'm driving at here. And a lot of fields got planted in the last week or two. Hopefully you guys caught some of the showers, but if you hadn't, again, I was case in point that Monday, week and a half ago, June 3rd or something like that, you might have been pushing some of the field conditions and like, oh, we're going to get rain. And so then you've got seed slots that are open up or have poor depth control and didn't get the rain. And so that's where we might have some issues with emergence. And so in this case, it happened to be access to soil moisture. So 1.25 inches down the row, inch, 3/4 inch. And so just as you can imagine, soils were drier and drier as the depth was shallower and shallower closer to the top, and no rain to come into the forecast anytime soon on this scenario. And so the idea of, okay, don't have the water, just going to sit versus those that are developing. So we have a plant now that's 1, 2, 3, 4, V4 to V5 versus those that are just coming into VE, VC. I want to just kind of transition a little bit into what may happen. We've got in this pattern of warmer temperatures, hot temperatures, some thunder boomers coming through. Who knows if we'll catch some hail. And so I'm just going to end on a hail scenario that we did a number of years ago and the potential yield loss that comes from those. It goes back to the way soybeans can really adapt. Think about the amount of leaf area that a soybean can get over a given ground area. If we're 3 to 4 times the leaves over a given square foot, so if we have 4 square feet of leaves over 1 square foot of soil, that's more than enough to optimize yield, to optimize light interception, to create photosynthesis for that plant. We're going to have a lot of these fields that will be upwards of 5 or 6 times the amount of soil area with the number of leaves above it. And so when we catch a hail event or some sort of damage, it can withstand a fair amount and still yield well to even have no yield damage. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to advance past these vegetative stages and get into, real briefly, not a lot with the time I've got left, reproductive stages. So at R1, we're just talking about an open flower anywhere on the main stem, right? And just continue to grow rapidly. This is a stage that I talk about, R1 to R2. By the time we're flowering out the top, upper 2 nodes on R2, we'd love to have the canopy closed. So that's an ideal world. Kind of give you a scenario of planting dates affect roughly late April or early May. We're going to be reaching R1 typically end of June, early July. And if we're the end of May plantings to last week, we're going to be middle of July. So just kind of put that in context. Here's that green to the eye that I've talked about with a 15-inch versus a 30-inch row that comes into comparison. R2, again, upper 2 nodes that have a flower open there. At this point, if you've heard me talk before, this is one of the stages I really enjoy because then I can have an assessment of how we're progressing and what's to come. If I count the number of trifoliate nodes at this point, usually we've accumulated about half. And so if I'm counting up a plant that's got a 9, 10 trifoliate node at this point, I think we're doing pretty good. 18, 20 nodes are probably going to occur by the end of the season. If we only have plants that are on the order of 6 or 7, the trifoliate nodes are 2. It is going to be a shorter plant in terms of trifoliate nodes, as well as the potential for pod development on those same main stem nodes. All right, so defoliation, and then we'll wrap up, see if there's any questions. So had a number of years looking at simulating defoliation at various growth stages. R1 and R3 were our targets initially, and then we added in later the latter 3 years of another study, R4 and R5. So here's a scenario of 2 maturity groups. I'll just show you the 2-7. This is over in West Lafayette. At R1, okay, so no defoliation event. And then we go into a very systematic 25% leaf removal, 50% leaf removal. And I'm color coding this too. As you look at this, 50% is in that gold or yellow, 75% defoliation in pink, and then 100% defoliation of just the trifoliate leaves, of the leaves in that red. So at R1, what it looks like. Let's look at some recovery just based on pictures. And so we use this as a proxy for canopy closure. Never went into the leaf area indices, as I was alluding to. That's the idea of how many layers of leaves over one given square meter of soil. So that's would provide the fuller story. But in taking digital pictures, this is a way that we can look at canopy closure in a hurry. So at 50% leaf removal, a couple days after the event, and then 7 days after, how much the recovery was occurring. And then by 16 days, you could probably even say that that's almost back to what a normal looking field would have. And I'll show you another graph on that. And then by 23 days afterwards, fully canopied. And then let's jump off the cliff with 100% defoliation and how long the recovery occurs, 7 days, 16 days. So you can still see the sun hitting the soil on this one. It's going to take longer. And even 23 days, you can see bits of the soil showing through. So still not even fully canopied by 23 days afterwards when it was a severe, quote, hail event. If we want to look at the recovery rates in a weekly, more or less weekly basis, let's just follow that 50%. So at that point, day 0, most of them were around that 60% or so canopy closure, so leaves over a given ground area. And then in 0, so there's no defoliation. By the time we were 14 days later, we had maxed out on canopy coverage, right? And so even when we had 50%, so this is that gold, 50% of those leaves taken off at R1 and then allowed to recover, the recovery, it was slower, right? But by 2 weeks later, it was canopied as well. And so you might anticipate that there's probably not going to be a major yield effect on that, maybe a little, because you do have 2 weeks of lag. If you go to 75%, it lags out a little bit more, like 3 weeks. And then you go to that 100%. So it really dips down, takes a while to recover, right, because it doesn't have any leaves there to rebound. So you got small leaves that are trying to develop and then capture sunlight and develop. And so that pushes us out nearly probably a month or so before we get back to canopy closure. That's at R1. So over 3 years on that study, R1 here in the black line, and this is percent max of yield. When we took out 25% of those leaves at R1, I mean, that's 2-3% maybe yield loss versus you come down to our at 50% defoliation, maybe on the order of 5%. And then now when we're talking 75% defoliation, that's maybe a 15% yield hit versus down to 100% defoliation is, maybe a 25% or yield hit or 75% of the max potential. So again, hail events that will probably come, they do, spottiness, thunderstorms that we'll probably be having. Just put that in context that it can withstand a fair amount of damage and still yield well. We pushed it to R3 just to look at growth stage effects of this. So this is when you have a pod that's 3/16 of an inch or longer on one of the pods on the upper 4 nodes. All right, I'm not going to get into all this in an early season talk, but just to kind of give you an idea of, here's R3 now. 50% defoliation when the plant was originally R3, and then the recovery rate 8 days later, 18 days later, 25 days later. You can still see a little thinniness, a little patchiness to that. 100% defoliation 8 days later, 18 days, and then 25 days. So clearly, as you go into further development, it does not have the capacity to recover as quickly. We're into pod development and seed development, and then we're also starting to reach the point of maximum overall vegetative leaf development anyway. So this is where it's going to start to hit us harder, because we don't have the time of the growing season as well as physiological time of the plant to recover those leaves. So yield loss and recovery is probably going to be more damaging as you might anticipate. So follow along. Overall development of that plant, that 2.7 being 95% canopy coverage, and then these quote hail events come in, and then even though we're taking out half of them, the loss of a canopy closure is not nearly as bad as you would anticipate, because even taking half those leaves, you've got those extra layers like I talked about. If we have 3 to 4 layers of leaves, we're normally pretty good on the yield level. A lot of these fields, soybeans already have 4, 5, or even 6, and even higher than that layers of leaves. So taking those out, if let's say we've got a plant that's 6 or 7 layers of leaves over that given square foot, you take half those away, it's still a 3.5 leaf area, and to that one given ground area, the yield loss should be fairly minimal, and you'll see that play out here to come. And then 100% that hits us never recovers. And again, looking at the pictures, the previous slides, you would anticipate that. So what does that look like when you have the yield? So repeating this, just now have the R1 still set there. Now we'll come into the R3. R3 is in green, and so very linear over 3 years, didn't change. It was a striking yield loss. So when we look at, let's just look at the 50% defoliation, the yield loss at that point was maybe on the order of 20-25%. You don't have the leaf recovery as much, but think about what you have lost is the pods. You don't have the time for those to develop and to come back. And so there's been some lost energy there on the developing pod, and then moving forward, coming into the higher defoliations. And then just to drop off the cliff, again, I'm not going to get into it fully, but we did R4, R5 a number of years later, and they seem to hold on a little bit longer and then drop off pretty readily with the higher defoliations. So with that, I think I'm going to just pause there and just see if there's questions.
If you have questions, you can use the chat or unmute yourself, ask yourself.
Back to when we were talking about rotary hoes, would you consider a rotary hoe if it's a long-term dry period after the crusting event occurred? Would that make it more sense?
So say that one more time. So if you're looking to do a rotary hoe,
and there's no rain in the forecast and you got crusting.
Yeah, I would be more apt to run that in that scenario than those if I guess I have eternal hope that if you got some potential rain in the forecast, I'd much rather have a softening rain to help push those through than the rotary hoe. But if you don't have it, I think I would be more apt to break that up. There might be some that have the contention that if you don't have rain in the forecast, then you're going to lose out on the soil moisture that you do have. I go back to, I think I want to break that up and allow those to merge with limited restrictions in the crusting. Well, I'll put up maybe 2 other slides here, and then see if there's anything else. So I just want to, I'll just jump this one. So planting dates that we've talked about, hours of sunlight, and reaching various growth stages. So as we plant later, right, we're going to have development of bloom, pod development. They get pushed back because it is this combination of photoperiod and heat units. So in this scenario, May 7th is the starting point. Let me get a laser going. Starting point May 7th, and then when we reach R1, that last week of June, 1st of July, pushing us into reaching R7, R8, into September, late September, 22nd. And then as I've talked about and know a lot in the area up in the Northwest in particular, didn't get in until 3rd, 4th of June. And so what does this mean for your overall development? So it is going to push it back. We're going to be reaching R1 well into July. We'll probably be that middle to late July when we reach that point. So just kind of have that in the mind. Reaching R3 coming into the first week of August, give or take. So if you're trying to forecast a little bit with herbicide applications, so think about those that maybe occur before R1, R2. Or thinking about, or even white mold if we turn back to a cooler, wet condition. So think about it, middle of July. Probably not going to be that way, but who knows? We're hot now. Maybe it'll switch to the cooler side. So just put that in the back of your mind. And then when you're switching to R3, mindset R3, R4 with any foliar fungicide or insecticide sprays with those that are planted last week. We're really looking at if they're probably that given mid to full season for your area. Probably looking to first week of August to even second week of August to be pulling the trigger on those kind of conditions if that's what you've experienced. So I want to put that in there. Obviously, these other ones are much later. And then I wanted to, a lot of you guys in that area have heard me talk on this, but I'll leave it as a kind of concluding thought of what we found on the sulfur side. Of where we're at in any application. So, let's leave it fully up. So we continue to work on this and fine tune this. Ideal is usually at 15 to 20 pounds of sulfur. If you've got fields that are probably more prone to it, more of a soluble product like AMS or even gypsum. The one thing that comes to mind, and we'll be doing this next week up the La Crosse area, but we've done the tissue sampling, we've done foliar sprays, and so when we're looking at a V4 type foliar spray, when I've been looking at these, we broke saying that we need spray grade AMS is what we've been using, 4 pounds of sulfur, so that's what, 15 pounds of product or so dissolved, to attain as optimal of a yield in a foliar spray. I am of the mind, and that's what we're starting to look at this year, I am of the mind that even at V4, if an applicator was available to spread like a granular AMS versus doing a foliar spray, I'm of the mind, that's what we're looking at this year, that I would rather spread that 15 pounds of sulfur through a granular AMS than do a foliar spray. I think that the opportunity for more yield and recovery is better in that scenario, even with the tire damage that would occur if we're thinking about a rogator that can spread versus doing a foliar spray. So basically anytime from planting until V3, V4, I think that's still the better route to go. We're going to get data to back that idea up more than just doing a foliar spray at V4. Now what we have done with these foliar sprays was a V4 and R3. I have not seen any gain in terms of later with a granular spread. So I think the vegetative period to V3, V4 with a granular spread is probably going to be more return on investment if you've got those kind of fields versus doing a foliar spray, especially even though next week V4 is not going to cover the row per se. We are going to have upper 80, 90 degree weather, so opting for damage or crop phytotoxicity is there, so that's where I like to switch back to more of the granular. So just kind of thinking what I'm looking at this year on those subjects. And then if you are doing leaf sampling, to look at the critical levels. Are we close to 0.25% or lower? And then looking at our nitrogen to sulfur ratio, in particular when we go to about R1, R2, if you even want to take some samples, V5, V6, that's our earlier side, but to start to give you an indication that we are in an imbalance. I have noticed in the last week or so on those fields that are planted earlier in May, B3 type plants, we are seeing some manganese show up, again, northwest part of the state. So just be on the lookout, especially as we're drying out. So if you haven't been on the lookout for those sprays, you want to be considering that. And then back to the sulfur side of it. The sulfur, if you had it up front, tends to help with some of that micronutrient availability. So you're probably not going to see as much of an issue on those fields as those that have not had the spray or spread, I should say. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any other questions or thoughts, or you guys can give me a holler. All right, Bill. Well, I look forward to any follow-ups if you have any. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you guys.
Thanks, Shaun. I'm just going to put up our CCA sign-in sheet, and it's got the that little square. If you have the app, you can scan that. For people with commercial applicator license, you can email me your number and I will get you entered in and we can get you credit. If anyone has any other questions for Shaun, I know Bob was saying he's not getting around the state as much. I'm not sure about you, Shaun, but if you got any other issues coming up in soybeans, I'm sure you would appreciate people letting you know.
Yeah, I definitely would. It's hard to get around. I mean, we've got some freedom to do it, but yet at the same point, still want to be cautious. So I agree. Thank you for sharing that.
Hey, Phil, this is Marty Park. I just wanted to thank you for going the extra mile and putting these together. They've been good. So thank you.
No problem. We're trying new things and with new situations. So glad they could help. And I think people appreciate the recordings. I've heard several saying they watched recordings. So. All right, with that, we're going to end it. And thank you all for listening and be on the lookout for more things. I know up in the Northwest with our summer field, I guess for all of the state, our summer field days, we're going virtual. So be looking for how to do that. And we're going to be trying to do some different things. Hopefully get some video out in the field so people can look at things. But another new thing that we're trying out this year. So, all right, everyone, have a good day. And if you have any other questions, just let me know.
Thanks, Phil.